May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please do take your seats. I read recently that Prince Philip once commented on the length of sermons in church. And Prince Philip observed that the mind can only absorb what the backside can endure. Now, I assume he was sitting on wooden pews rather than these very comfortable and supportive seats that we have here at Cornerstone. But seriously, the Bible teaching that we have in our services is to equip us for endurance in the stresses and the strains and the pressures of our lives. And we're in a mini-series which we've called Beside Quiet Waters, inspired by those words not from this psalm, but from Psalm 23, which we felt the Lord speaking to us as he leads us down this mountain. And as he restores our soul beside quiet waters. And today we're in Psalm 62. It'd be really helpful if you have that in front of you whilst I preach. There are real life, ancient situations that lie behind many of the Psalms. We can't always be certain of what the specific situation was, and in some ways that doesn't matter too much. But this Psalm of David might have been composed in his early days when he was exiled from the court of Saul, or in later days, perhaps when his son Absalom rebelled against him. Whatever the specifics, and that doesn't matter too much, it's clear that this song is composed in a crisis. And that helps us because few, if any of us, would experience exactly the same kind of situations that King David did. Although you might find that some of the words that he uses to describe his experience might resonate with you for other situations. But more than that, it helps us that it describes and that King David knew the same God that we know. God who grants us a stillness amidst the stresses. And Psalm 62 is a psalm for such times. So firstly, we see in verses 1 and 2 the place of rest. And note before I read these that David doesn't begin his song with the crisis, but he begins his song with confidence in God. Verse 1, truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I shall never be shaken. Friends, this opening is the key to facing the strains and the stresses that we encounter. Amidst the cacophony of voices, of chattering, of information that fill our ears, our eyes, our hearts during a crisis, we need to declare right at the start that our God is all sufficient. And the sense of the opening verse here is that my soul waits in silence in God alone. My soul waits in silence in God alone. A soul that is silent and still in the presence of God, quietly waiting for the salvation that can only come from him. And the way these verses are written emphasize that God is our only, as we've been singing this morning, our only source of confidence, of faith, of trust. That our hope is in God alone, truly, only. It's emphasized with really a deep earnestness. If you have a look at the metaphors of protection in verse 2 and later on throughout this psalm and others, well, that if you've been a Christian almost for any length of time, then you'll be familiar with descriptions of God, pictures of God being like a rock, a fortress, metaphors of protection, might, refuge. And if, as the years go by, maybe those pictures, those descriptions just trip off our tongue, they're almost over familiar for us, then this psalm and the way it opens is a psalm for a time when dark days make us really mean them. Do verses 1 and 2 come with a richness and a depth to you in 2021 that they didn't have in 2019? The place of rest is on the rock of God, in his fortress. And it's very important that we realize this rest, stillness, can be found and can be known in the middle of hectic activity, stress. The image of the image of this series on the screen. You might spot that actually an image beside quiet waters, but if you look at on the right hand side, there's a red car in the background. And I'm sure we could have probably airbrushed that out, but I decided we'd leave it in because I wanted to signify in some small way that sometimes quiet waters are found near the traffic of life. That photograph's taken in Ashford in the Water in the Peak District, you might know it. Lovely place to have a picnic beside quiet waters. But just over a stone wall, there's traffic belting down the A6. Sometimes we can find this stillness very close to the traffic of life. And it's in this place of rest that we sing, "Be still, my soul. The Lord is on your side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to your God to order and provide. In every change, he faithful will remain. Be still, my soul, your best, your heavenly friend. Through thorny ways, leads to a joyful end." The place of rest. And secondly, the pressures of life. As this psalm was being read, did you notice that it's not a psalm that's some form of escapism? Rather, it is brutally realistic about the pressures of life. Look at verse 3 with me. "How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down? This leaning wall, this tottering fence? Surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse." One writer, I can't remember which writer it was, but one writer observes how evil here is attracted to weakness. Do you see that? Giving a last push to what's leaning, to what's tottering, to what's fragile. And yet also evil is attracted to strength. It's the target of its envy. And the writer goes on to observe what a contrast that is with the goodness of our God. Our God who spares the bruised reed. Our God who enables us to find strength in what? In weakness. Our God who invites us, as Colin preached so powerfully last week, our God who invites us in Christ to come to him and find rest. Friends, this psalm enables us to look the pressures of life in the eyes. Not to ignore them, not to pretend they're not there, but to look the pressures of life square in the eyes. And sometimes it is by facing the storm that then a stillness from God can descend. A calmness within. Even as the storm rages without, a calmness within. And it's a calmness in which we begin to see things God's way. Of course, this calmness can bring a reverent awe and a wonder of its own. Remember how the disciples responded in the storm on the lake? Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." And they were. Well, this left the disciples in awe, asking, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. Be still, my soul. Your God will undertake to guide the future as he has the past. Your hope, your confidence, let nothing shake. All now mysterious shall be bright at last. Be still, my soul. The waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he lived below. Isn't that a wonderful lyric, that last line? Be still, my soul. The waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he lived below. Yes, it's right to speak frankly of the situation and the threats, to look the pressures of life in the eye. But it's also right, wise, and good that David doesn't brood on them further. And so he turns his focus elsewhere, verses 5-8. Yes, my soul find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I shall not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. You know, there have been various moments in this pandemic where I've not followed the pattern of this psalm. And that's been to my cost. And as I look back, it's usually been that I've been checking the news apps on my phone or laptop too regularly. And here's what would happen. The headlines of the crisis would leap out at me. And I'd read some of the articles, and some of the statistics, some of the reports. And then I'd begin to feel overwhelmed. But then I'd just keep going back to my news feed or returning to it at regular intervals throughout the day. And that just didn't help my well-being, didn't help my faith or walk with the Lord at all. I was, as it were, just stuck going round verse 3 and 4, as it were, just stuck going round those verses in this psalm, going round and round, only looking at the pressures, only staring at the stresses, only dwelling there. So in those times, eventually, I decided to limit my intake. I've realized this week it's called a news feed for a reason, a news feed. And I realized that I needed to adjust my diet in those times. Sometimes I took some news apps off my phone, at least for a while. I needed to change my diet or supplement my diet and actually just move on into the rest of the psalm, to verse 5 onwards, to fill my mind with God and truths about him, experience of him, to feed on him. And maybe you've had similar experiences with your, well, it might be your diet of news or some other pressure in life. Look them in the eyes, but don't dwell there. Don't brood on them. Dwell upon and in God. We've talked about having a still soul. Well, a still soul is not inactive. Strange as it might seem, a still soul needs to be maintained. Stillness has to be actively held. Just as any parent knows that saying something once to our children isn't usually sufficient. Well, so it is with us as children of God. And in verse 5, David counsels himself with a lesson that he already knows from verse 1. He comes back to it in verse 5. He encourages himself, yes, my soul find rest in God, my hope comes from him. You see, the battle to shape our hearts with the truths that our mind already know, that's never over. In fact, it's unlikely that I will say anything today that you don't know already. But as God's people, as God's children, we need to be reminded regularly. Just as a navigation system or any kind of measurement system needs to be regularly calibrated. So our hearts and our lives need regular recalibration to walking with the Lord. Because we wander off. We lose track. Of course we do. And you know, that's one of the reasons why gathering together for weekly worship has always been deliberately such a central part of the Christian life. To recalibrate, that's one of the things we're doing, recalibrating our hearts and our walks with God, because we're so prone to wander. And I've been so encouraged to see more and more people coming back for in-person worship as the weeks go by. And we're doing all that we can as the government roadmap continues to enable more people to do that safely week by week, and we'll share more details on that in the coming weeks too. This stillness in the stress needs to be held, maintained. And it also needs to be shared. Do you see how David talks to himself in the verses I've just read? And then he doesn't keep it to himself, he talks to others too. He shares with others. Verse 8, trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. David has found God to be his solid rock in his crises, and he calls on others to share his experience of this same God amidst their trials. I really like the way that Tim and Kathy Keller express this. We can best help others with their fears and distress when we have been through our own and found God faithful, our rock and refuge. You know, I think it's been very significant for us as a church family that we've been able to, for these last few weeks, talk in groups of 6 or 2 households out in the car park. Someone just mentioned to me in passing a couple of weeks ago now as they were walking through, they just said, it feels like a glimpse of church life, ordinary church life has returned. And you know, our conversations after services are actually a very important time of ministry for us. A time for us to share not only our troubles, but our trust in God. Like just last week, I really appreciated praying with someone in the car park as we were chatting, and I prayed for them, they prayed for me. A deep blessing to me. And I think we've really missed this aspect of church life over the last year. And just while we're on this, let me also say, some of us will slip back into conversation in the car park really easily, really naturally. It'll be like we've never been away. Yet for others of us, and this is where I'm at, we might be a bit nervous about it. Honestly, I am feeling a little bit rusty in knowing how to speak to people that I don't work with or live with. And maybe you feel like that as well. Maybe you feel like you've lost some of the skills of just ordinary conversation with people you don't know very well over the last year. Well, if that's you, don't worry. In my experience, it's gradually coming back the more we try it. So don't worry if you have an awkward conversation or you're tripping over your words or you don't know what to say. Don't worry. That's exactly what I've been doing for the last few weeks as well. You might want to wait a few weeks before you have a conversation with me. I might be might have warmed up by then. But seriously, the important thing is that we're sharing our lives, we're sharing our troubles, but that we're sharing also our trust in God. You see, a people of refuge, as these verses talk about and indicate, are a people that together sing, "Be still, my soul, when dearest friends depart, and all is darkened in the veil of tears. Then shall you better know his love, his heart, who comes to soothe your sorrows and your fears. Be still, my soul, this Jesus can repay. From his own fullness, all he takes away." And fourthly, we find stillness amidst the stresses from the perspective of eternity. I'll read verses 9 and 10 firstly. Surely the lowborn are but a breath, the highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods, though your riches increase. Don't set your heart upon them. We might be familiar that the scriptures teach us that we have nothing to fear from people, but they also teach us that we have nothing to hope from people either. David urges us not to put our trust in the elites or in the masses. And that description there of lowborn and highborn, it's a literary device used as a way of indicating everyone in between as well. It's futile to place our trust in human beings. And that description of humanity as being like breath, that reminds us a similar word, similar terminology we saw in the letter of James recently. The transient nature of humanity. Now, of course, God gives us gifts of financial resources and of people, but those are to be gifts, not objects of our faith or for us to become absorbed with. I really like the way that James Montgomery Boyce puts this. He says, if God has given you faithful and good friends or a loving life companion, thank him for it. It is his gift. But do not place your deepest hope in man. Instead, trust him who is eternal and unchanging, and you will never be shaken when people disappoint you. Wise words. And in verses 11 and 12, in the midst of the many things that buzz around his brain and are hurtling around his heart, as happens for us in times of crisis, doesn't it? David centers on one thing, verse 11. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love, and you reward everyone according to what they have done. There are numerical sayings like this, 1 and then 2, sayings like this in various places in the Old Testament. Here it serves to emphasize and reiterate what God has said about himself. God is powerful, and he is a God of steadfast love. God is strong, and he is a God of mercy. God is sovereign and faithful to his covenants. And as his children, we can rejoice and rest in these two attributes of God. We live in a world that demands justice, don't we? We've seen that. We live in a world that demands justice. And yet, we also live in a world that desires love. And there are times when our world desperately seems to want justice to be poured out and love to prevail. Yet, how can this be? Because justice demands judgment and love demands mercy. How can God be both just and loving? Well, the answer for us and for our world is found in the cross of Christ, where God poured out his judgment upon himself in Christ, satisfying the demands of justice, and where God demonstrates his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The cross of Christ supremely demonstrates both God's love and his justice. And so as the psalm concludes by assuring us that God deals justly with those that he has made, we can find a stillness even amidst the stresses because of the cross of Jesus Christ. And as we are raised to life with him, we can sing, "Be still, my soul. The hour is hastening on when we shall be forever with the Lord. When disappointment, grief, and fear are gone, sorrow forgot, love's purest joys restored. Be still, my soul. when change and tears are past, all safe and blessed, we shall meet him at last.